It's time to talk more about the Pollaxe sword thing. Hi folks, Matt Easton here, Schola Gladiatoria. Now, hopefully all of you watching this channel also watched Todd's channel, and you will have seen that we did a collaboration recently. A few weeks ago I was over there, and this is the mystery medieval weapons, weird mystery medieval weapons, and he unveiled this to me on screen and gauged my reaction, and we did some testing with it. Now, if you haven't seen that video, you absolutely need to see that video, so check out the link below to that video. And of course lots of other very good videos on Todd's channel. Awesome stuff, and we'll be doing plenty more collaborations, and we are going to do another video together with talking about this weapon, or maybe how they were used, looking at some people sparring with sparring versions of these. Now, we can't hit each other with these because we kill each other really quickly. There are a lot of questions about these Pollaxes, if we call them that. There's various different names. I actually asked my patrons for some suggestions, and I think that my favourite name so far is Hilted Pollaxe. So because these are so rare and so unusual, we don't really know what to call them. We have no idea what they called them in period, but I will call this a Hilted Pollaxe because that kind of makes sense. And actually the person that suggested that name was Matt, no less. I don't know your full name, I'm afraid. But so the Hilted Pollaxe. Now, there were a few things that maybe didn't come up explicitly in that video that I did at Todd's place a few weeks ago. And one of those things was that I think I did mention this on video actually, but I am actually quite familiar with this weapon in the British Museum, the one that Todd based this replica on. Okay, I was a student at UCL in London when I was at the Institute of Archaeology 20 years ago, more than 20 years. And I used to spend quite a lot of time at the British Museum, and I was familiar with that weapon 25 years ago. And as I mentioned on video, it's a strange weapon tucked away in an unexpected place. It's not with the other medieval weapons. It's not even in the medieval section. It's actually in a sort of 17th century Commonwealth section, because it has a Commonwealth emblem on it, suggesting, and the British Museum have dated it to the 17th century. But I think they're wrong. Why do I think they're wrong? Well, I think that the form of this probably doesn't fit into the 17th century at all, certainly not into the Commonwealth period. I think that emblem was put on it at a later date. But there is another very important reason and clue that I didn't mention on Todd's video because I wanted to save it for my own video, and that is, it ain't the only one, folks. There's another one out there. So that's right, folks. The big news flash here is that there is another one of these. Now, there are only two known of, so these are still weird and wacky weapons. But what that does show us is, number one, this isn't a completely unique thing. It's not just one drunken blacksmith on a Saturday night decided to make one of these. The fact that there are two of them either suggests that they are a distinct subset of weapons that we just don't have any other examples of, or we haven't yet found other examples of, and perhaps that's an interesting avenue of new research. It's just something we don't know about. Or, and this is my working theory, folks, they're a pair. Now, I showed, once I got back from Todd's, I actually told him about this. I said, I think there's another one out there. I think I've seen it. I'm going to try and find it when I get home. And I did find it, and indeed it's at the Royal Armouries. Now, there is a point of connection between these two things. First of all, they're both in England, okay? Now that's significant. It's significant because it's not like one's in Italy and one's in America or something like that. The fact is they're both in England. So that immediately gives you a good chance that either they're part of a distinct subset of weapons. My guess would be from around Henry VIII's reign, early 16th century probably. Perhaps end of the 15th, but probably Henry VIII's time. And this is my working theory, they were actually one of a pair that were made for some specialised tournament. Now, we know that in the Tudor period tournaments under Henry VIII were a massive thing, and they did have lots of weird and wacky types of weapons and rules, much like Emperor Maximilian had lots of tournaments that obeyed specific rules. Henry VIII was trying to copy that, was trying to do similar things. So I suspect that these two weapons, while they're not identical, I mean, Todd completely correctly pointed out they've got different pommels on them, they've got different grips on them, but overall they're remarkably similar. So I think that they were a pair, and they were probably made for a tournament in England, probably under Henry VIII. Why has the one in the British Museum got a Commonwealth stamp on it? I suspect because they were both taken during the English Civil War by parliamentarian forces, probably from some royalist estate somewhere. One of them was used for some ceremonial civic duties and had a Commonwealth emblem slapped on it, and was probably used as some bearing mace type thing, which were used by cities up and down the length and breadth of the country, and indeed in London as well, and for parliamentary purposes. Whereas the other one presumably ended up in some other collection and then ended up in the Royal Armouries. I think it's way beyond coincidence that we should have these two very, not unique, but very, very rare, very specialised objects, and one ends up in the British Museum and one ends up in the Tower of London thereafter the Royal Armouries. I don't think that's a coincidence. I think one was looted by Cromwell's forces and they got separated. So the question next comes, what are these things for? What are some strengths and weaknesses of them? Some aspects of the design. We're going to look at all of these things in this video. And also I have some specific questions from my patrons on Patreon. I opened this up to them. I said, look, guys, have you got some specific things you want me to address? So we're going to look at some of those questions as well. So some basic physical characteristics of this. We talked about this with Todd, so I'm not going to go hugely into depth of this, but just very briefly. Essentially from here upwards, it's pretty much like a poleaxe or a warhammer, okay? The one curious thing is it's got that belt hook, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And obviously the standout weird thing is it's got a crossguard and then essentially a sword hilt. Hence we're calling this the hilted poleaxe. For any of you who don't know, a normal poleaxe looks something more like this. In fact, it looks exactly like this because this is a more normal poleaxe, okay? So usually they have a wooden shaft. You've usually got some type of butt spike or shoe at the end, queue as it's called in French. Then you've usually got a hammer and a spike, or a hammer and an axe, or an axe and a spike. That's the usual combination. And then a point at the end, your principal stabbing point at the end. You've usually got langets to protect the wooden shaft down here, and then often, not always, you have a guard down here. Now you'll notice the use of a cross guard instead of a disc guard is completely specific to swords, and this is usually specific, at least in Europe, to pole weapons. We don't only find them on poleaxes, we also find them on glaives and alspies and various other types of pole weapon. And indeed on rondel daggers, if you think about it. So a rondel guard, very common in pole arms, but absolutely weird having a cross guard on a poleaxe. Okay, the other thing to mention about it is shorter. I'm actually going to talk about the length because I noticed something comparing these two things a little bit earlier before filming this video. Okay, so overall it is a shorter weapon, and this is bloody heavy. Now, just talking about the weight, Todd, completely hands up, said he had to base his replica here on measurements and observations through the glass front of the cabinet in the British Museum. So he didn't know categorically whether this was close in weight to the one in the British Museum because he couldn't get the one in the British Museum out of the cabinet. However, what he didn't know at that point was we've got this other one in the Royal Armouries, and very nicely the Royal Armouries have published lots of statistics of theirs on their website. And we can see that indeed Todd's here weighs about 7.5 pounds, and indeed the Royal Armouries one weighs 7-point-something pounds. So actually they're completely in the same ballpark. Now notice the similarity of weight and proportions again comes back to the fact that I believe these were made as a pair. They're not identical, but I think they were made as a pair to be used against each other, probably in a tournament setting, but we'll come back to that in a bit. So this is relatively heavy. Now, funnily enough, this poleaxe, you might think, well, how much does the poleaxe weigh then? Despite the fact it's a lot longer, this poleaxe, because it's got a wooden shaft and different proportions, actually weighs about 5 pounds. Okay, so in fact, slightly under 5 pounds. So this, despite the fact it's a bigger weapon with greater reach, is in fact lighter. That being said, not all poleaxes are as light as this. This is a fairly light end of the spectrum poleaxe, and some poleaxes are definitely heavier than this. And so 7.5 pounds is not ludicrous at all for a poleaxe weight, but for something of this size, it is particularly heavy. Now, I mentioned something specific about the size of this, and I didn't think about this when I was at Todd's, but I've certainly thought about it when comparing it to my more conventional Pollaxe here. And that is, we talked about reach, okay? And that is because we tend to look at the total length of the weapon, and you see it only really comes up to about my navel, in fact, pretty much exactly my navel, whereas a conventional Pollaxe is usually about the same height as a person. Sometimes it comes up to about the collarbone. Sometimes they're shorter than that, admittedly, but usually a Pollaxe is about the same height as a person, very occasionally slightly taller, but not usually. These are, of course, intended to be used in armour, close in, so they're not the same purpose and use as a bill or a halberd or something like that. So So on the outset, yes, it is a shorter weapon and it is heavy. However, if we actually think about how a Pollaxe is often used, and in fact, if I put the novelty Pollaxe down, the hilted Pollaxe, and I pick up a normal Pollaxe here, you will notice, look, we've got a disc guard there and we've got a long shaft. I can move my hands up and down this shaft. I can extend the weapon out and hit from a very, very long way away. However, if we look at treatises, manuals, just period art in manuscripts and stained glass windows and things like this, usually in close-in fighting, Pollaxes are usually held more or less in the middle. So the hand is kind of more or less close to the guard, okay? So that the back end can be employed liberally for stabbing and indeed pushing and hitting, and in fact the middle is used as well, okay? Now, if we keep the hand there, let's shift it over to my left hand, and now let's take the novelty hilted Pollaxe in my hand. They've actually got the same reach. So actually, although it is a shorter weapon, from the guard upwards, it's pretty much the same length as a conventional Pollaxe. Where it doesn't have the length is the back end of the shaft. So quite clearly, what we lose with the hilted Pollaxe is that back end. We don't have anything, I mean, except for a pommel, we don't have any extension out here to stab or strike with. We do have a bit between the hands that we can use, but the extension at the head end is actually not that different to a conventional Pollaxe. That might tell us some things about the ways they were intended to be used. Maybe they were being used with certain types of specialised harness. Maybe there were some Pollaxe rules at the time which specified that you weren't allowed to use the back end of the Pollaxe, or you weren't allowed to move from a certain spot. Maybe they were fighting over a barrier. This is something we know is sometimes done. So maybe there's some missing information we don't know about the use of Pollaxes in a tournament situation where perhaps they were only allowing the person to use one end of the Pollaxe. And in that context, perhaps it now becomes useful and relevant to actually have a shorter end to the back end of your Pollaxe, because now you can move it from one side of your body to the other. And if you're wearing a tonlet armour with a big tonlet and an extra heavy breastplate and a great bassinet and things like this, then maybe there's some advantage to having a shorter Pollaxe which doesn't have the extension out the back. This is all supposition, all guessing. And obviously, if you've got any further ideas on that specific topic, feel free to post underneath. So one other point that came up in Todd's video that I did with him was the question of this so-called belt hook. And Todd is of the opinion, or at least in the video he voiced his opinion, that that's not a belt hook. Now, first of all, why would we assume it was a belt hook? Well, quite simply, there are a whole bunch of weapons, particularly warhammers and maces, which have a built-in belt hook on them. How is the belt hook used? I do have a belt under here, as it just so happens. And quite simply, the thing goes on there. Now, there is a problem with this Pollaxe and why Todd thinks it's not a belt hook. Number one, look, I'm not holding it and it's falling over. The point of balance, okay? The point of balance is in the wrong place. It's, instead of being in a place where the belt hook would keep it on the belt, it's actually in a place where the weapon would want to invert itself and fall off the belt. So on this replica, the point of balance is not in the right place. Now, it's possible that pommel's too heavy, and Todd concedes that. Maybe that pommel on the original is hollow. I have to say, the Royal Armourer's example of one of these has the remains of a belt hook, so that also had a belt hook, if it is a belt hook, although it's broken off now on that one, but it has the remains of a belt hook, and the pommel on the Royal Armourer's one is much smaller. A possible idea here is that the Commonwealth marked one in the British Museum, maybe the pommel's a replacement. Maybe the pommel fell off and someone put a heavier, bigger pommel on, we see that there's a smaller pommel on the Royal Armourer's one, and that would change the point of balance. So maybe this is indeed meant to be a belt hook, and indeed, that's what I believe it is. I believe it is no different to any other belt hook. I believe it is a belt hook, and I think that the pommel on the British Museum example, and ergo the one that this is a replica of, is a bigger, heavier pommel than the original pommel that was on the weapon. Okay. Now, Todd's theory is that this is a blade catcher. Now, blade catchers are a fun thing, and there's a lot more to be said about blade catchers. And indeed, if a sword came down here, you could potentially trap a blade in here. However, is that optimally designed to do that job? I would say no. Okay. Generally speaking, to have a blade catcher, why not just have something bigger that's actually going to catch it more easily instead of something so slim here? Secondly, why only have it on one side? Thirdly, why have it on this specific weapon? Because this is probably not going to be used against someone who's cutting with a sword at you. It's probably going to be used against another poleaxe. And there are many more reasons. So I personally do not even at all believe that this is a blade catcher. I believe it's a belt hook, and I believe that the pommel was changed. So now we're going to look at some specific questions which were posed by various of my patrons on Patreon. And the first question is a fairly broad question. That's why I'm tackling it first, because it fits well into the narrative of this video. And this is from Vacuous Mermaid, which I assume is not a real name. And Vacuous Mermaid says, why would you use this instead of a conventional poleaxe? Well, I've kind of looked at this question already in this video, in the extent that it's clearly specialised for a specialised purpose, isn't it? It's not as long as a poleaxe, and let's be frank, you cannot wear this type of poleaxe, okay? Unless you're playing Bannerlord and it magically floats on your back as if from a magnet, you cannot wear a poleaxe like this. If you put it down, you've got to physically put it down, and then you have to go and get it again when you need it, or you might lose it, okay? So absolutely this, assuming that that is a belt hook, and even if it's not, you could just jam it down behind a belt up to the crossguard. You can physically wear this, okay? That's one advantage of it. Number two is, it is more or less indestructible. Okay, I managed to bend this repeated times at Todd's place, but I didn't break it, and I couldn't have done, okay? So it is basically indestructible. Third reason is that we don't have that back end pointing out. If for some reason, because of the armour being used, or the rules in the tournament being used, or the certain type of battlefield conditions, if it is a battlefield weapon, which I don't think it is, there might be some specific reason why a person wants to not have a back end on their poleaxe, but still have as much front end reach as a conventional poleaxe, and still have a crossguard of a poleaxe. Why have a crossguard instead of a disc? Well, it does offer more protection, okay? Potentially, if you're intending to go against other certain types of weapons, perhaps the crossguard might offer more protection towards your gauntleted hands than a disc will. I can't really say much more about it than that. There's also the novelty value, and we shouldn't overlook the fact that particularly with judicial tournaments, but also just tournaments in general, there was often a kudos, I guess, to thinking up some new funky weapon combination to use in your tournament, and I think that's where this fits in. But in terms of warfare on the battlefield, generally speaking, I think that both Todd and I agree that a conventional poleaxe is a far more practical weapon. Because whether you're fighting people on foot or horseback, you've got the ability to extend a very, very long way and stab a horseman on top of his horse, keep horses away, to contend with people using other polearms like halberds or spears or whatever. You can sort of match their reach to some degree. But then if you're in full armour against someone else in full armour, you've got the full ability to switch in and fight in really into close range with this type of weapon, with all of the different options that you've got built onto this thing. So I think that this is a far more versatile, and as it turns out, lighter and nimbler and longer weapon than the hilted poleaxe is. So my patron Jay Lefevre asks, judicial combat, why? Why do I think that this is a judicial combat weapon? Well, I think I probably covered that mostly already. But I think also, to add to that, I think it's not a very versatile or practical battlefield weapon. It's very heavy for its size. If you're wearing it, it's got an incredibly long hilt sticking out in an uncomfortable and inconvenient way. It's difficult to, I would say, run around or ride around with it, it doesn't offer any real advantages over a Pollaxe, except for the one option that you can wear it. Now, at that point, I would caveat everything I said previously with saying, I don't know. I don't actually know for certain what this was used for. And I think it's really important to not pretend that we do know. I personally feel that this is a weapon for tournament fighting, specially made, along with the other one that's in the Royal Armouries. And they were made for some novelty tournament. I don't think that these were battlefield things. But that being said, we find some pretty weird medieval and Renaissance weapons on the battlefield, don't we? So it's entirely possible that someone thought this, someone and someone else, because there's two of them, thought these were really good weapons for the battlefield. So it's entirely possible. But I would say if I'm hedging my bets and putting my money on one or the other, I would say that this is probably for tournaments, or not judicial duels perhaps at this date, but for tournaments of some kind. So my patron Nate the Albatross asks, again I think not a real name, I ask, how effective is this crossguard? Is it more effective than the disc guard that we find on conventional poleaxes and indeed glaives and various other things as well? Now I would say at this point it's basically the same as comparing a sword hilt or sword guard with a disc guard on a poleaxe, because that's what it is. Okay, so to basically answer the question, the cross guard on the hilted poleaxe is just as effective as the cross guard on a sword is. Now, one of the reasons that sword guards are like that is because they're comfortable to wear. Okay, disc guards, you can't really wear them very easily unless you completely change how you wear them and the hilt's sticking out in front like a katana might be worn. But generally speaking, cross guards can sit against the body quite conveniently, and they do offer, by geometry, quite a lot of protection. So clearly a weapon can come down here and not get past the crossguard front or back, and it will come off the shaft, and that will protect you. Just as with a sword. Okay, so this will protect you damned well. However, it doesn't protect the sides as well as a disc guard does. And also, important to note, it's more likely to get in the way. We've already talked about the fact that with a poleaxe, you normally move your hands up and down the shaft a fair amount. Here you can't. You can only move it a little bit up and down this mini shaft, the length of the grip. Okay, so that is kind of in the way. Yes, you could grip above, but then the crossguard is going to kind of get in the way of you and your armour. Not very convinced that they ever would have gripped up here, especially with that belt hook being there. It just all kind of gets in the way a bit too much. But in terms of protectiveness, yes, as good as it is on a two-handed sword, basically. Now, my patron Eric Nunley asked a very similar question, and that is, can this guard bind in the same way that a sword guard, a long sword guard or arming sword guard can? And the answer is yes. Again, it's basically exactly the same, isn't it? It's just, at the end of the day, it is a two-handed sword hilt. Here's a two-handed sword of more comparable size. There we go. That's you know, fairly comparable. Okay, the hilt is longer, the grip's longer on the poleaxe. But nevertheless, it's going to do the same things in the same ways as the longsword or two-handed sword can. Absolutely. The only thing I would say is that with the poleaxe, with something that's very tip heavy, okay, that binding and then winding, if we're doing Lichter now, for example, is kind of weird with a poleaxe. And yes, I guess you could do it. If someone swings one weapon at you, you could parry a thing or strike into it up here and then wind into thrust. But having all of these projecting things at the end and that weight makes it a bit weird. It doesn't work quite as well with swords. So binding and winding and thrusting, the guard can do it as well as a sword, but the blade, the rest of the weapon up here, I think is more likely to get tangled and is less likely to be successful at that type of technique. Now, two of my patrons asked similar and related questions. One is Mac Fuzzle, asked, can it be used one-handed? Well, let's go outside and see in a second. And Ivy Mike asked, could it have been used from horseback, and possibly that the hook here is for hooking onto a saddle rather than a belt or scabbard type arrangement? So first things first, I don't have a horse and I don't really know how to ride. Okay, so that's one for Jason Kingsley or Zachary Evans or someone else basically. But My basic impression is this is absolutely not a horseman's weapon. The basic reason being that you've got an immensely long hilt sticking out here. And we all know that, yeah, okay, something like a bastard sword can be used from horseback, okay, where you don't have too much hilt sticking out the back. But once you get into sort of spadone and montante territory, apart from the blade length, you don't really want to be using this from horseback because of the excessively long hilt. And this is comparable. You'll notice that the hilt is almost exactly the same size and length as a spadone or montante. So quite simply, no. I do not think it's a horseman's weapon at all. I also think it's way too heavy and unwieldy to use from a horse without very likely killing your horse in the process. So no, not used for horse. But can it be used one-handed? So I think the upshot of that is, yes, you can physically use it one-handed, but you really wouldn't want to. I mean, you know, 7.5 pounds with a huge, great long grip, no, not really well suited to using one-handed at all. And final question from my patrons that I decided to take was from Michael Kustenig, who asked, could this have been used like a montante? For those of you who don't know what a montante is, just very, very briefly, because this would be a topic for a whole nother video, this is a montante, as it would be called in Spain. If this was in Italy, it would be called a spadone. If it was in Germany, it'd be called a Beidenhander probably, although modern people might know it as a Zweihander. Now, these big two-handed swords have a very specific method of use. This is the Kveiten version, incidentally, very, very nice, which a review will be forthcoming on. And they have a very specific method of use that is often employed against multiple opponents or to occupy or guard a space and prevent people passing through it. And they are humongous great swords, but actually for their size, quite nimble, much more nimble than a poleaxe. So could this be used, could the hilted poleaxe be used like a montante? Well, first of all, it's a lot shorter, okay? But the hilt, as we've seen, is very comparable, actually. It's got similar guards, similar grip length, but the upper end of the weapon completely different. It is a different type of heft and balance. This has got distal taper, this has got the opposite of distal taper. This gets heavier towards the end instead of lighter towards the end. So it doesn't move in the same way. But let's have a little try anyway. Let's see if I can move this around in something like a montante-ish fashion. So I think you'll agree the upshot of that is, yes, I can move the thing around in a very slightly montante-ish fashion, but it doesn't make an effective montante stand-in because it just doesn't have enough reach. It's too cumbersome and heavy at the head. It's not going to occupy a space and keep people away in the way that a montante will, because it doesn't have the reach or the speed that the montante does. So to conclude, it is a truly weird medieval weapon, and thanks again to Todd for making this. Because, as I say, I've known that weapon for at least more than 25 years in the British Museum. I was delighted to confirm that there is another one in the Royal Armouries. I think that they're probably literally of a pair, but we always have to bear in mind they might just be part of a subset of weapons that have just not been really documented before. Overall, as a battlefield weapon, I think it is much worse than a typical poleaxe. I think a typical poleaxe is far more versatile, far more useful, and was far more popular, we know. However, I do think that possibly there's some battlefield application for these that we don't know so much about, or specific type of armour, or specific method of fighting that meant that these might have been useful on the battlefield. But as you know by now, I think, by watching this video, my overall theory is that this is a specialised tournament weapon, in my view, probably made during Henry VIII's time, perhaps even for Henry VIII himself, because we do have both swords and armour surviving from Henry VIII's own armoury in the Royal Armouries and elsewhere in the Royal Collections. So the fact is that we do know a whole bunch of weapons and armour survived from Henry VIII's time for fighting in tournaments, fighting in the lists. I think, if I had to put my money on it, that this and the other one in the Tower of London or Royal Armouries are of that time and of that place, and I think they got separated at some point. This one ended up in Cromwell's hands, possibly had the pommel replaced. The one in the Royal Armouries probably had the grip replaced, but has got a more original pommel on it, but has lost the belt hook, but we know also had a belt hook. So very interesting pair of weapons, and I'm hugely grateful to Todd for making this and letting me get my hands on it and test some of my theories on it. But as always, I am fascinated to see your comments and reactions underneath and your theories. Do you know of any examples of these in art? Do you know of any others surviving? Do you have any other theories why these might have been invented, perhaps beyond some of the ideas that I've had in this video? So get commenting, get thinking, and share this video around, because I think the more people that see this video, we increase our chances of finding other ones or finding other data about what these things were and perhaps how they were used and when they were used and who by. So thanks for watching a lot again, and thanks again to Todd for lending me this. You will be seeing this weapon in action in some form or another soon, and I will see you back on the channel again soon for another video, hopefully. Take care, folks. Thanks for watching. We've got extra videos on Patreon. Please give our Facebook a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Cheers, folks.